My name is Rachel Stone, and I am 35 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that the person who knew me best in the world was my sister Emily because we grew up in the same house, shared the same room for years, were each other's. Close fought over small things and defended each other in front of everyone else. People used to say we were inseparable, and I believed that because it was easier than questioning what I did not see. Truth did not come to me. Loudly it did. Not arrive with a single moment of shock. It came slowly, quietly, in pieces so small that at first I ignored them, the kind of details you notice but push away because they do not fit the picture you have already accepted started on a morning. That felt completely ordinary. I woke up at the same time I always did. I made coffee the same way. I always did. The window in my kitchen was slightly open and the air was still cool from the night. Nothing about that morning suggested that anything in my life was about to change. There was a letter on the table when I walked in. Not unusual, not urgent. Just another envelope among many others, but something about it made me pause. Not fear, not instinct, just a quiet hesitation, like my mind noticed. Something before I did consciously. I picked it up, slowly turned it over, saw my name printed clearly, not handwritten, not familiar, and I opened it without thinking too much. Inside was a credit report, and for a second I did not understand what I was looking at because it did not match anything I knew about my life. There were accounts listed, balances, transactions, dates. Everything looked official, everything looked real, but none of it belonged to me. Stood there reading the same lines again and again, trying to find the mistake because there had to be one. This kind of thing does not just happen without reason. I told myself it was an error. Maybe someone entered the wrong data. Maybe there was a mix-up. Maybe it would be fixed with one phone call. So I called, and the voice on the other side was calm, professional, distant, the way people sound when they deal with problems that are not theirs. She asked me to confirm my identity. I did, and then she told me something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said these accounts have been active for over 2 years. So, years. That number did not make sense to me at first because 2 years is not a small mistake. It is not a temporary issue. It is time enough for something to grow, for something to become real, for something to be intentional. I asked her for the address connected to the accounts, and when she gave it to me, I felt something inside me go completely still because it was not unfamiliar. It was my childhood. Home, the same house where my parents still lived, the same place where my sister spent most of her time. I ended the call and sat down without even realizing it. The coffee I had made was still untouched. The room felt the same, but something inside me had shifted. I started thinking, not emotionally, not with panic, but with logic. Who had access to my information? Who could use my identity without raising suspicion? Who had the opportunity? And the knowledge of the answer came too quickly, and I did not want to accept it. Emilish had always been the one everyone trusted, the responsible one, the organized one, the one who handled things when my parents needed help with documents. They called her when something needed to be signed or submitted. She took care of it when I moved out years ago. I left behind files, papers, copies of things I never thought twice about. She had access, but access is not proof, and I needed proof. Days passed, and I tried to ignore it, but ignoring something does not make it disappear. It only delays the moment you have to face it. Then another letter arrived, different bank, same pattern, more accounts, more debt. And this time there was something else, a contact number. I stared at that number for a long time because I recognized it immediately. It was hers. I did not call Harry, did not confront her because I understood something in that moment. If I acted too soon, I would only get denial, excuses, confusion. I needed clarity, not emotion. So I started collecting everything. I created a folder, simple, plain, nothing special, and inside it, I placed every document, every statement, every report, every detail that connected back to those accounts. As the days passed, the folder grew thicker, and with it, the truth became clearer. This was not an accident. This was not temporary. This was repeated intentional control. She had been using my identity for years, and the most unsettling part was that nothing about her behavior had changed. She still called me, still laughed, still spoke to me like everything was normal, like there was nothing hidden between you. See, watched her more closely during family dinners, during small conversations, during moments that used to feel natural, and I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before: the way she avoided certain topics, the way she redirected conversations, the way she stayed in control of what people knew. And what they did not weeks turned into months. And the more I discovered, the harder it became to pretend. I did not know the truth. There were loans. I never signed purchases. I never made accounts. I never opened all under my name. All connected back to Hearth moment. Everything became undeniable. Was not when I saw the total amount. It was when I saw a transaction made recently, something expensive, something unnecessary, something that could not be explained as survival or desperation. And I realized she was not just using my identity because she had no choice. She was using it because she could. That realization did not make me angry. It made me clear. I stopped questioning. I stopped doubting. I stopped hoping there was another explanation based there was nothing. That was when I made a decision. I would not confront her quietly. I would not argue. In private, I would not give her the chance to reshape the truth. I would wait. I would let everything come out in a moment where it could not be denied, where it would exist in front of everyone, where silence would not protect Tightened. I knew exactly when that moment would come. Me cousin's wedding, a place full of family, full of people who trusted her, full of people who believed we were exactly what we had always appeared to betrothed sisters. Close, unbreakable, really, carried the folder with me. That Dana in my hand, not where anyone could see it, but with me because I knew something they did not be the end of. That day, nothing would be the same, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of that. The wedding day arrived with the kind of calm that usually comes before something breaks, but no one else could feel it except me, because I was the only one carrying the truth with me, the only one who knew that behind the smiles, behind the music, behind the decorations, something real was about to surface. One arrived early, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to observe. I wanted to see everything clearly before the moment came. The venue was already filling slowly, relatives greeting each other, laughter moving from one corner to another. My parents were there, standing together, talking to distant cousins. My mother looked happy, the kind of happiness that comes from being surrounded by people she trusts. My father stood beside her, calm, quiet as always, and then Emily arrived. She walked in like she always did, confident, composed, smiling at everyone as if she owned every room. She entered, people turned toward her instantly. She hugged my mother, kissed her cheek, greeted my father with ease. Nothing in her movement suggested fear. Nothing in her expression suggested guilt. She looked exactly like the sister everyone believed her to be. And for a moment, I watched her from a distance, trying to understand how someone could live two completely different realities at the same time. One visible, one hidden, one built on trust, and the other built on something else entirely. She saw me a few seconds later. Her face lit up immediately, and she walked toward me without hesitation. "Rachel," she said, wrapping her arms around me as if nothing had changed, as if everything between us was still intact. I hugged her back, not tightly, not coldly, just enough to match the moment, and when she pulled away, she looked at me with that same familiar expression, the one that made people feel safe, the one that made people believe her. "You look tired," she said softly, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. She always shifted attention, always redirected the focus away from herself. "I am fine," I said, and she nodded, as if she accepted that answer, even though she never really listened. She linked her arm with mine and guided me toward the main area where the rest of the family was gathering. And as we walked together, I realized something important she had no idea. She was walking beside the person who knew everything. The ceremony passed like a blur words. Spoken vows exchanged applause, rising and falling people, smiling, clapping, celebrating. Love, while I stood there holding a different kind of truth inside me, something that did not belong to that moment, but was about to enter it. Whether anyone was ready or not, after the ceremony, everyone moved toward the reception area. Music started. Drinks were served, conversations grew louder and more relaxed. The atmosphere shifted into something lighter, something easier. Emily stayed close to me the entire time, talking, laughing, introducing me to people I had already met, as if reinforcing a narrative that had been built over years. "Look at us," she said at one point, smiling at a group of relatives. "We are still inseparable." And they laughed, agreeing, nodding, believing every word. I did not respond. I just looked at her for a second longer than usual. And in that second, I wondered if she believed it too, or if she had convinced herself so deeply that the line between truth and lie no longer existed. The evening moved forward. Slowly, dinner was served. Speeches began one after another. Stories, memories, laughter filling the room. And then Emily stood up. She took a glass from the table, tapped it lightly to get attention, and the room quieted almost instantly because people listened when she spoke. She knew how to hold attention. She knew how to shape words in a way that made people feel something. She began with a light joke, something simple, something that made everyone relax, and then she turned toward me, raised her glass slightly, and said, "I want to say something about my sister Rachel." The room shifted again, softer now, more focused. People looked at me, smiling, expecting something emotional, something warm. She continued, saying, "We grew up together, shared everything, fought over nothing important, and no matter what happened, we always stayed close." She paused for a moment, just enough to let the words settle, and then added, "I do not say this often, but I'm proud of her. I always have been." And the room responded exactly as she expected: soft applause, warm expressions, approval from every direction. And I stood there listening, feeling the weight of every word, not because they were kind, but because they were false. And I realized something in that moment. This was the version of the story she had been protecting. This was the image she needed everyone to believe, and if I stayed silent, it would remain unchallenged. I reached for my glass, slowly, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, just enough to signal that I was about to speak. Emily looked at me, expecting gratitude, expecting a simple thank you, something that would close the moment neatly. I lifted my glass and said I would like to respond. My voice was calm, steady, not loud, but clear enough that people turned toward me immediately, expecting continuation of the same tone, the same warmth. I looked at her directly and said, "Thank you, Emily, for everything you have given me." And there was a small shift in her expression, not obvious, but present, because something and my tone did not match the expectation. I continued without changing pace, saying, "You gave me access to things I never asked for, responsibilities I never accepted, and a life that was never mine to live." The room grew quiet, not instantly, but gradually, as people started to understand that this was not a typical response. Emily's smile held for a second longer and then faded slightly as confusion replaced it. "Rachel," she said quietly, trying to interrupt, but I did not stop. I placed my glass down, reached into my bag, and took out the folder, setting it on the table in front of us. And I said, "These are the accounts opened in my name over the past 2 years. These are the debts. These are the transactions. And this is the number connected to all of them." And I looked at her again and said, "Do you want to explain or should I continue?" Silence spread through the room completely. This time, no movement, no sound, just attention focused entirely on us. My father leaned forward slightly. My mother's expression changed from confusion to concern. Emily shook her head, quickly stepping closer to me, lowering her voice. "Rachel not here," she said, but I answered at the same volume as before. This is exactly where it needs to be, because this is where the truth belongs now. My father stood up slowly, taking one of the pages from the folder, reading it carefully, line by line. His face tightening, not with anger yet, but with realization. My mother moved beside him, looking at the same page, her hand trembling slightly. Emily reached out as if to take the paper back, but stopped halfway when she saw my father's expression. "Emily," he said quietly, "is this true?" And for the first time, she did not answer immediately. Her silence lasted just long enough for everyone to understand what it meant. She finally said, "I was going to fix it," and those words changed everything, not just because of what they admitted, but because of what they confirmed. There was no misunderstanding, no mistake, no confusion. Only truth exposed in a moment that could not be undone. And as I stood there watching everything unfold, I felt something unexpected, not relief, not satisfaction, just stillness, the kind that comes when something hidden is finally seen and cannot return to the shadows again. No one spoke for several long seconds after she said those words, and in that silence, something important happened, not outside, but inside each person in that room, because until that moment, there was still a small space for doubt, a small chance that everything could be explained away as confusion or misunderstanding, but her words removed that completely. She did not deny. She did not question. She admitted it in the simplest way possible, and sometimes the simplest words carry the heaviest weight. My father remained standing, holding the paper in his hand, his eyes moving slowly across the page again, as if reading it one more time might change something, but it did not. My mother looked at Emily, not with anger at first, but with disbelief. The kind that comes when your mind refuses to accept what it is seeing because it does not match the image you have held for years. "Rachel," my mother said quietly, her voice almost breaking, "tell me exactly what this means." And I took a breath, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that what I said next would not just explain the situation, it would change how she saw everything that came before it. Means she used my identity to open accounts, to take loans, to spend money, and she did it repeatedly over 2 years, and every one of those actions was done using my name. My details, my credit, my life. My words did not rise or fall. They stayed steady, because emotion would have made it easier for someone to dismiss them, but calm made them real. Emily stepped forward, quickly shaking her head, as if trying to undo what had already been said. "You are making it sound worse than it is," she said, her voice sharper, now more defensive. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed time. You always do this. You always turn things into something bigger than they are." And for a moment, I almost felt something like recognition, because that was her pattern shift. Blame, reduce, impact, control the narrative. But this time the room was different. This time there was evidence in front of everyone. This time it was not just her words against mine. My father placed the paper back on the table carefully and looked directly at her. How much he asked in that question carried more weight than anything else, because it was no longer about if, it was about how far it had gone. Emily hesitated, her eyes moving briefly toward me, then back to him, as if calculating whether there was still a version of the truth she could present that would protect her. But there was not anymore. "I do not know exactly," she said finally, and that answer caused something in my mother to shift completely. "You do not know," she repeated louder, now her voice rising for the first time. "You do not know how much money you took using your own sister's name." And something broke in that moment, not physically, but emotionally. The illusion of control, the image of certainty, the belief that everything could be contained, it all started to collapse. Emily's composure cracked further, her shoulders dropping slightly, her voice losing the smooth confidence it always carried. "I was going to fix it," she said again, but this time the words sounded weaker, less convincing, almost like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. I opened the folder again and pulled out another set of pages, placing them on the table in front of my parents. I know exactly how much I said, and I watched as my father picked up the pages again, reading more slowly. This time more carefully, as if each number carried a separate meaning. My mother leaned closer, her eyes scanning the lines, her breath becoming uneven. The total is here, I said quietly, and I pointed to the bottom of the page. My father's hand stopped. Moving when he reached it, he did not speak immediately. He just stared at the number, as if trying to understand it in a way that went beyond logic. My mother looked at it next, and the sound she made was not loud, but it was enough to fill the room. A small, sharp intake of breath that carried shock, disbelief, and something deeper, something like realization. This is not possible, she said, but it was possible. It was right there in front of her, and there was no way to look away from it anymore. Emily stepped back slightly, as if the distance might protect her from what was happening. You are overreacting, she said again, but her voice lacked strength now. It no longer carried control. It sounded uncertain, almost fragile, and that was when my father spoke again, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly enough that everyone heard him stop. He said, and for the first time, she did. He looked at her in a way I had never seen before, not as a father looking at his daughter, but as someone trying to understand a stranger. Why, he asked, and that question was different from the others, because it was not about facts. It was about motive, about choice, about something deeper. Emily opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out immediately, and in that pause I realized something. She did not have a simple answer. There was no single reason that could justify years of decisions. No clear explanation that could make it understandable. I needed help, she said finally, and the words sounded smaller. This time not confident, not convincing, just exposed help. My mother repeated, her voice trembling. Help does not look like this. Help does not come from stealing from your own sister. Help does not come from lying to everyone who trusted you and us. She spoke. I could see the weight of everything settling on her, not just what Emily had done, but what she had not seen, what she had not questioned, what she had allowed to exist without noticing, and that realization was heavier than anything else. In that room, I stood there quietly watching everything unfold, not stepping in, not interrupting, because this was no longer just about me. It was about all of them, about trust, about family, about the gap between what we believe and what is real. Brett, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke, his voice low, almost uncertain. Emily, what is she talking about? He asked, and she turned toward him quickly, her expression shifting again, searching for support, for something familiar to hold on to. It is not like that, she said, but he did not look convinced. He looked confused, unsettled, as if the version of her he knew was no longer stable, and that was when I understood something clearly. This moment was not just exposing the truth, it was changing how everyone saw her, not because I was attacking her, but because reality was finally visible. I closed the folder slowly, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been shown. The rest would not be solved here, not in this room, not in this moment. It would take time, conversations, consequences, things that could not be rushed. I looked at Emily one more time, and for the first time since all of this started, I did not feel anger. I did not feel hurt. I felt distance, the kind that comes when something breaks in a way that cannot be repaired by words. Alone, this is not over, I said quietly, and she looked at me as if she already knew that, because some actions do not end when they are exposed, they begin there. And as the room remained still heavy with everything that had just happened, I realized that the life we had all been living, the version of our family we believed in, had already changed. We were just seeing it clearly now. For the first time, the room did not return to normal after that moment, and it never would, because once something like this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It settles into every conversation, every memory, every look that passes between people. My mother sat down slowly, as if the strength had left her body all at once, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes Not on anyone, but somewhere distant, like she was replaying years of trust in her mind, trying to understand. Where it began to break, my father remained standing. For a few seconds longer, then he pulled out his chair and sat down without speaking his posture straight. But his face changed in a way that made him look older than I had ever seen him before Brett stepped away from the table, moving toward the edge of the room, his hand on his forehead, his breathing uneven, like someone trying to process too much too quickly. Emily stood in the center of it all, no longer in control, no longer leading the moment, just standing there as everything she had. Guilt started to collapse around her. She looked at me again, but this time there was no confidence in her expression. No calculated calm, only something uncertain, something exposed. Rachel, she said quietly, as if trying to find a way back into a conversation that had already moved beyond her control. We can talk about this at home, we can fix this. And the word fix sounded different. Now it no longer carried promise, it carried avoidance. I shook my head slightly, not rejecting her completely, but refusing. The version of reality she was offering, this is not something that gets fixed quietly, I said, and my voice remained steady because I had already moved past the point of confusion, past the need to argue. I was standing in clarity now, and clarity does not require volume. My mother finally looked up, her eyes moving between both of us. Emily, how long, she asked, and that question was not about numbers. It was about duration, about how long this had existed without her knowing how long she had. Then living beside something she did not see, Emily hesitated again, and that hesitation said more than any answer could. 2 years, she said softly, and my mother closed her eyes for a moment, not crying, not speaking, just absorbing the weight of those words. 2 years of trust, 2 years of belief, 2 years of not knowing. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped together tightly on the table. Why did you not come to us? He asked, and his voice carried something deeper, now not just anger, but disappointment. The kind that settles heavily because it comes from expectation. I did not want to worry you, Emily said quickly, and that answer caused something sharp to pass across his face. You did not want to worry us, so you chose to do this instead, he said. And there was no need for him to raise his voice. The meaning was already clear, the logic already broken. Brett spoke again from where he stood, his tone quieter now, more controlled, but still uncertain. Emily, is there anything else? He asked, and the question hung in the air longer than the others because it carried the possibility that this was not everything, that there might be more hidden beneath what we had already uncovered. Emily did not answer immediately, and that silence was enough. My mother opened her eyes again, this time looking directly at her. Tell me everything, she said, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly enough that it could not be ignored. And for the first time, Emily looked like she did not know where to begin, not because she lacked words, but because there were too many truths to choose from, too many things that had been hidden for too long. I stepped back slightly, giving space, not physically, but emotionally, because this part was no longer mine to lead. It belonged to them now, to the family, to the consequences that would follow the truth as it continued to unfold. People around us remained still watching quietly, no longer part of the celebration, no longer part of anything familiar, just witnesses to something real, something uncomfortable, something that had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room. Emily finally spoke again, slower, this time less controlled, more honest. I had debt, she said, and the simplicity of that sentence contrasted sharply with everything that surrounded it. What kind of debt? My father asked, and she looked down briefly before answering. Credit cards, loans, things I could not keep up with, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became. This had not started as something calculated, it had started as something desperate, but somewhere along the way, desperation had turned into habit, into choice, into something repeated, even when there might have been other options. My mother shook her head slowly. Why did you not tell us? She asked again, and this time there was something different in her voice, something softer, something almost like regret, because she was no longer just asking about Emily's actions, she was questioning her own absence in those moments. I thought I could handle it, Emily said, and for the first time her voice broke. Slightly, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded sympathy, but enough to show that something inside her was no longer holding together. I thought I could fix it before anyone found out, but the truth was already out. It had been sitting quietly for months, waiting for the moment when it could no longer stay hidden. Brett walked back toward the table, slowly, his movements careful, like he was stepping into something fragile. You used her name, he said, looking at Emily, and she nodded once, a small movement, but enough to confirm everything again. And in that confirmation, something shifted in him as well. Not anger, not yet, but distance, the kind that forms when trust begins to break. I watched all of it without speaking because there was nothing I needed to add anymore. The truth was already present in every direction, in every reaction, in every silence that filled the room. My father leaned back in his chair finally, his eyes closing briefly, then opening again as if he had reached some internal decision. This does not stay here, he said quietly, and everyone understood what he meant. This was not something that could be ignored or hidden. It would move forward. It would have consequences. It would require action. My mother looked at me then, and for the first time since everything began, there was something in her expression I had not seen before, not just shock, not just confusion, but understanding, the kind that comes when you realize something important too late. Rachel, she said softly, and I met her gaze without hesitation. I am here, I answered, and that was all I needed to say, because this moment was not about winning. It was not about proving something. It was about truth being seen, and once it is seen, it changes everything, even the parts you wish could remain the same. Emily sat down finally, her posture no longer strong, no longer controlled, just still, and in that stillness, the reality of what she had done, what she had hidden, what she had caused, began to settle fully, not just on her, but on all of us. And as the noise of the room slowly started to return in small, distant ways, people speaking quietly, moving, uncertainly, trying to continue what had already been broken, I realized that nothing would go back to the way it was, not after this, not after the truth had taken its place in the center of everything and refused to move. The days that followed did not feel real at first. It was as if everything had slowed down, and yet at the same time, nothing waited for anyone to catch up with it. The house felt different. The silence carried weight. Every room held pieces of what had happened, and no one knew exactly how to move inside that new reality. My mother spent most of her time in the kitchen, not cooking, not cleaning, just standing there, sometimes holding a cup of tea that would grow cold in her hands. My father stayed outside longer than usual, fixing things that did not need fixing, checking the garden twice, walking around the yard as if he could find answers somewhere between the grass and the fence. Brett stopped coming home early. He would send short messages saying he was working late, but no one asked questions because everyone already knew that he was trying to create distance from something he did not understand. How to face. Emily stayed in her room, the door closed most of the time, and when she came out, her steps were quieter, her presence smaller, like someone trying not to take up space. I did not avoid her, but I did not approach her either. There are moments in life when words do not help, and this was one of them. In the third morning, after everything came out, my father called me into the study, the same room where he kept his papers, his old files, and the small safe that now meant something very different than it had before. He was sitting at the desk when I entered, a stack of documents in front of him, his glasses low on his nose. He did not look up immediately. He finished reading the page in his hand, then placed it carefully on the table, and finally raised his eyes to meet mine. Sit down, he said, and I did. He took a slow breath, as if choosing his words with care. I have been going through everything, he said. Every account, every statement, every transaction, and the more I look, the more I realize this did not happen overnight. I nodded slightly because I already knew that truth had a way of building quietly before it reveals itself all at once, Saphir. Is more, he continued, and something in his tone made me straighten a little in my chair more. I repeated, not because I did not understand, because I needed to hear him say it clearly. He turned one of the papers toward me. This account, he said, pointing to a section on the page. This was opened 8 months ago in your name. My eyes moved across the paper, slowly reading the details, my name, my information, my signature, but I had never seen this account before. I had never opened it. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, not shock this time, but something heavier, something that confirmed this was deeper than I had allowed myself to believe she used. Your identity again, my father said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. For a moment, I did not speak. I simply looked at the paper, absorbing what it meant, how far this had gone, how many lines had been crossed without anyone knowing until now. My father leaned back in his chair. I contacted the bank this morning. He said they are freezing the account pending investigation. I also spoke to a lawyer. We cannot ignore this, Rachel. This is not just a family issue anymore. I looked up at him then and saw the shift in his expression. This was no longer about protecting Emily or avoiding scandal. This was about facing reality, no matter how difficult it became. I understand, I said, and my voice did not shake because something inside me had already accepted this direction. When I left the study, I found my mother sitting by the window in the living room, the sunlight falling softly across her face, but she did not look at it. She was staring at nothing, her thoughts somewhere far away. I walked over slowly and sat beside her for a moment. Neither of us spoke. Then she reached for my hand, her grip gentle but firm. I should have seen it, she said softly, and I turned my head to look at her. You could not have known, I replied, but she shook her head slightly. A mother always knows, she said, and there was no anger in her voice, only regret, the kind that lingers because it cannot be undone. Later that afternoon, Brett returned earlier than usual. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether to step inside or turn away. Emily came out of her room when she heard the door. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, everything that had been unsaid passed between them. We need to talk, he said, and his voice was calm, but distant. Emily nodded once and followed him into the other room. The door closed behind them, and for a long time there was no sound. I stayed where I was sitting, not because I was avoiding them, but because I knew this conversation was not mine to be part of. Some things have to unfold without an audience. Some truths have to be spoken in private before they can exist in the open again. When the door finally opened, Brett walked out first, his face pale, his expression unreadable. He did not look at anyone. He simply walked past and left the house. Emily remained inside, standing in the same place she had been moments before, her shoulders slightly lowered, her hands empty. That evening, my father gathered us in the living room, not as a formal meeting, not with raised voices or accusations, but with a quiet seriousness that made everything feel heavier than before. I have spoken to legal counsel, he said, and his words were direct, clear. There will be an official investigation into the accounts, into the use of identity, into everything that has happened. My mother closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of those words pressed down on her again. Emily did not react immediately. She simply listened, her expression still, her breathing steady, as if she had already expected this outcome. This is not something we can hide, my father continued, and his gaze moved between all of us, not just Emily, but me, my mother, even the empty space where Brett had stood earlier. This will take time. It will be difficult, but it has to be done. No one argued, no one interrupted, because deep down, we all understood that there was no other path left. Later that night, I stood alone in my room, looking at my reflection in the mirror, trying to recognize the person staring back at me. Everything had changed so quickly, yet at the same time, it felt like this had been building for years. Small signs, missed, small moments ignored, until they became something impossible to overlook. Now there was no turning back, no way to return to what we once believed was normal. I heard a soft knock on the door and turned to see Emily standing there. She hesitated for a second before stepping inside. "Rachel," she said quietly, and I waited, not rushing her, not filling the silence. She took a slow breath. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, and her voice carried something real this time. Not an excuse, not a performance, just truth. I looked at her carefully, and for the first time I saw not the sister I thought I knew, not the person who had hidden so much, but someone who had lost control of something she thought she could manage. Intentions do not change what happened, I said gently, and she nodded. I know, she replied, was stood there in silence for a moment. Two sisters in the same room, separated by choices, by consequences, by a reality that neither of us could undo. "I am going to fix this," she said finally, and I did not respond immediately because I knew fixing something like this was not simple. It was not quick. It would take time, effort, honesty, things that had been missing for a long time. "I hope you do," I said at last, and my voice remained steady, not cold, not forgiving, just honest. She left the room, quietly closing the door behind her, and I remained there for a while longer, staring at my reflection again. But this time I saw something different, not confusion, not disbelief, but clarity. The kind that comes after truth has settled fully into your life and refuses to leave. The morning after that conversation arrived quietly, as if the house itself was trying to behave normally again, but nothing was normal anymore. The air felt thinner, the sounds sharper, every small movement carried meaning that did not exist before. I woke up early before anyone else and sat by the window watching the street outside, the same street that had always felt familiar. Now looked slightly unfamiliar, like something in it had shifted without warning. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of cupboards opening. My mother was already awake. I knew she had not slept properly for days. I dressed slowly, not because I had nowhere to go, but because there was a strange heaviness in even the simplest actions now. When I reached the kitchen, she was sitting at the table, staring at a list of papers spread in front of her. She looked up when I entered, but did not smell me. Her father left early, she said quietly. He went to meet the lawyer. I nodded and poured myself a glass of water, sitting across from her. She pushed one of the papers toward me. "These are the updated statements," she said, "everything they found so far." I looked at the pages but did not pick them up immediately. There were numbers, dates, accounts, things that once would have meant nothing to me, but now represented a pattern, a long hidden structure of decisions I did not make, but had been made in my Namehi. "Says there may be more," she continued, her voice low. I felt a small tightening in my chest. "More?" I asked again, even though I already knew the answer. "Is there anything else I should know?" She hesitated before answering. "I think so." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the clock in the hallway filled the silence, slowly, steadily reminding us that time was still moving forward, even if everything inside us felt suspended. I finally picked up the papers and began reading each line carefully. The further I went, the more distant everything felt like I was looking at someone else's life written in my name. Be midday. My father returned, his expression more serious than before. He placed his briefcase on the table and sat down without removing his coat. "We have a problem," he said immediately, and that sentence alone changed the atmosphere in the room. My mother straightened slightly. "What kind of problem?" She skied, opened the briefcase, and took out another file. "This one is connected to external accounts," he said. "Transfers that were not only local but international." My eyes moved quickly across the documents, foreign names, unfamiliar institutions, multiple layers of movement. It was not just misuse anymore. It was structure. It was planning. My father looked at me directly. "Rachel, your name appears in several of these transactions again." I felt that cold wave return, but this time it was deeper, because it was no longer just about one person using my identity. It was becoming something larger, something that extended beyond the family. "I did not authorize any of this," I said firmly. And he nodded. "I know," he replied, "but someone used your information beyond this house, beyond your sister. Word sister felt different now. It no longer carried warmth or connection. It carried distance, responsibility, confusion, everything at once. Emily had not come out of her room yet that day, and I wondered if she even knew how far this had gone, or if she was still holding on to the idea that it could somehow be contained. Later that afternoon, the liar arrived, the same one we had spoken to before, but this time his presence felt heavier. He laid out the situation in clear terms. There will be an official investigation, he said again, but now the scope is wider: identity misuse, financial fraud, and possible external involvement. I listened, without interrupting each word, adding another layer to something that already felt overwhelming me. Mother covered her mouth briefly, her eyes fixed on the table. "This is too much," she whispered, but no one responded because there was no simple answer to that statement. It was too much, and yet it was real. After the meeting ended, I stepped outside for air. The garden was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually feels peaceful, but now felt almost unnatural. I walked slowly along the edge of the yard, trying to steady my thoughts, but they kept returning to the same point. How had it reached this level? How had something that began in secrecy inside a family become something that now involved outside authorities? I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Emily was standing near the door. She had not spoken much all day. Her face looked tired, not just physically, but emotionally, like someone who had not fully processed the weight of everything. Yet she walked toward me slowly and stopped a few feet away. "You contacted me," she said softly. I looked at her, waiting. I did not respond immediately because I needed to understand what she meant. "Who contacted you?" I asked. Vanellish hesitated. "The investigator," she said. "They asked questions about accounts, about movements, about names," and I told them everything. I knew her voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it, like she was holding herself together with effort. "I did not know about the international transfer," she added. And I believed her in that moment, not because I wanted to, but because her confusion seemed genuine. "This is bigger than I thought," she continued, and for the first time she looked directly at me. "I am scared, Rachel, not of punishment, but of what this means." I did not answer immediately because there was truth in her words, but truth alone does not erase consequences. "I know," I said finally, and she nodded slowly. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving, neither of us knowing exactly what came next. Inside the house, my father was speaking with someone on the phone. His voice firm, controlled, the kind of voice he used when he had moved into decision mode. I could hear fragments through the open window: legal steps, documentation, escalation. Each word reinforcing that things had already crossed a point of return. That evening, when everything quieted down again, I sat alone in my room and opened my laptop. I did not know exactly what I was looking for at first, but I started going through older records, messages, emails. Anything that could give clarity. Patterns started to appear, small at first, then more obvious: connections between dates, between names, between moments I had not paid attention to before. Fear was a system beneath everything, not just reaction, but planning. And as I looked deeper, I realized something uncomfortable. This was not entirely contained within Emily's actions. There were gaps, moments where someone else had access, someone else had influence, someone else had seen and not stopped. I declosed the laptop slowly and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, because the truth was no longer simple. It was layered, and every layer made the situation more complicated than anyone had originally understood. Outside my door, I heard movement again, but no one knocked this time, and I did not ask who it was, because in that moment, I understood something clearly. This story was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about facing how far it had already gone and deciding what kind of truth we were willing to live with from here onward. The morning of part 7 arrived with a different kind of silence, not the heavy silence of shock, but the quiet that comes after decisions have already been made. The house felt emptier, even though everyone was still inside, as if something essential had already been removed, and we were only left with the structure of what used to be Normally father was the first one awake again. He had not been sleeping properly for days. I could tell by the way he moved slower now, by the way he paused before, speaking as if every sentence had to pass through careful internal checks before being allowed out. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I entered, papers spread in front of him, coffee untouched. Have a direction now, he said without looking up, and I understood immediately this was not a discussion. It was an update. My mother came in a few moments later and stood near the doorway. She looked tired, but focused in the way people look when they have stopped reacting emotionally and started functioning practically. What direction, she asked, and he finally looked up at both of us. Legal, formal investigation, fully active, he said, but there's something else. I felt a small tension rise in the room before he continued. The financial trail does not end with what we saw before. There are additional accounts created under variations of identity, not just Rachel, not just Emily, but modified records, slight changes in spelling, linked addresses, partial overlaps. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Again, not from shock, but from recognition of how deep this had gone. My mother sat down slowly. This is no longer just about mistakes, she said quietly, and my father nodded. This is organized, he replied. Those words changed the air in the room completely. Because once something becomes organized, it stops being an accident. It becomes intense structure, something deliberate, and that realization removed the last remaining illusion that this was only emotional damage inside a family Emily had not come downstairs, yet I noticed that absence immediately. She had started avoiding mornings lately, like she was delaying contact with whatever version of reality existed outside her room. I went to check on her after a while and found her sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, staring at her phone without scrolling. "Thee asked me to come in again," she said before I even spoke. I stayed in the doorway, not moving. "Are you going?" I asked, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, I have to." There was no confidence in her voice, just acceptance, like she had reached the point where avoidance was no longer possible. I sat beside her on the edge of the bed, not too close, but close enough that she did not feel alone. "What happens next matters," she said quietly, and I understood she was not just talking about herself. She was talking about all of US1. She left for the office later that morning. I watched from the window as she walked to the car alone, her movements slower than before. She did not look back. The rest of the day moved in fragments, my father making calls, my mother going through old files again, trying to find anything that might explain how long this had been building without visibility. I stayed mostly in the study, helping where I could, but mostly just observing the structure of everything unraveling and being rebuilt at the same time. By afternoon, the investigator arrived again, this time not just for questions, but with updates. The tone of the meeting was different, more formal, more direct. "There are multiple identities involved," he said, placing documents on the table. "There is evidence of coordinated access across different systems, and we're now expanding beyond family-level inquiry." I listened carefully to every word, but what stood out most was not the scale of it, but the fact that my name continued to appear in places I had never touched, never authorized, never seen after he left. There was a long silence in the house. My mother finally broke it. "I feel like I have been living inside a version of our life that was not real," she said softly, and my father did not disagree. That evening, Emily came back later than expected. When she entered the house, she looked different, not physically, but emotionally, as if something had shifted internally. She sat down at the table without being asked, and for a while, no one spoke. "Ethy, or widening it," she said finally, her voice calm but distant. "It is not just me anymore." "Oh no," I said, and she looked at me for a moment longer than usual. This time, there was no defensiveness, no denial, just exhaustion. "I did not know how far it went," she said again, almost like she needed to repeat it to convince herself, and I believed that she believed it, but belief does not erase impact. Me father placed the final folder on the table. The one that had arrived that morning. This is where it stops, he said firmly, not as anger, but as conclusion. Everything from here is controlled through legal process. Emily nodded slowly. I am ready, she said, and for the first time she did not sound like she was trying to fix anything. She sounded like she was accepting that she could not later that night. I stepped outside alone. The air was cooler, the sky clearer than it had been. In days I stood near the edge of the yard, looking out at the dark shape of the trees beyond the fence, and I realized something simple but heavy. This was no longer about discovering what had happened at it, was about living with what had already been, revealed and rebuilding from a truth that could not be undone behind me. The house was still lit, but for the first time, it no longer felt like the center of everything. It felt like the beginning of something after the collapse. The next phase did not arrive loudly. It came in the form of quiet mornings, longer silences, and people moving through the house as if every step had to be measured against something. Unseen, the investigation had officially expanded now, and with that expansion came a strange feeling that time itself had stopped belonging only to us. Everything was being recorded. Everything was being reviewed. Everything was being traced back to its origin. My father had changed the routine completely. He woke up earlier than everyone else and spent most of his time in the study speaking to lawyers and investigators. The door stayed half closed most of the day. My mother tried to maintain some sense of normal life, but even her small efforts felt fragile, like she was trying to keep a glass from cracking further by holding it too tightly. Emily had entered a quieter phase. She was still present in the house, but in a different way. Less defensive, less reactive, more withdrawn, as if she was finally seeing the full weight of everything without trying to reshape it into something easier to carry. I noticed she was writing things down more often, notes, lists, timelines, not excuses, just structure, as if she was trying to understand the shape of what had happened in a way that made sense to her. An afternoon, the investigator returned again, this time with additional files. He placed them on the table. Without ceremony, there is movement beyond what we initially identified, he said calmly. Accounts linked to third-party names and overlapping identity records. This is no longer contained within one individual or even one household. My father leaned forward slightly. What does that mean exactly? He asked, and the investigator paused briefly. It means, he said, that what started here appears to be part of a larger pattern involving multiple access points across different systems. Room went quiet after that statement, not because it was shocking anymore, but because it confirmed what none of us wanted to fully accept. This was not an isolated event. It was part of something structured, something broader, something that had likely existed before we ever noticed it. When the meeting ended, my mother sat down heavily in the chair near the window. She looked smaller than before, not physically, but emotionally, like the weight of everything had compressed her understanding of the past. I thought I knew my daughter, she said quietly, and no one answered because there was nothing to add to that moment. Later that day, I found Emily outside, sitting on the back steps. She was holding a notebook open on her lap, but not writing. I sat down beside her without speaking. For a while, the wind moved slowly through the trees, and for the first time in days, the silence between us did not feel sharp or tense, just Teredthi. Are saying there are more people involved, she said finally, and I nodded. I know. She looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about when it started, she said, not as an explanation, but as an attempt to locate a beginning. But I realized something. There might not be a single beginning there. Rarely is, I said quietly. She exhaled slowly. I thought I was managing it, she said. I thought I could control it before it got too big, and I did not respond immediately because I understood what she meant. But understanding does not simplify consequences. It only makes them more human. Inside the house, my father was still on the phone. I could hear fragments of his voice through the open window, phrases like verification required, expanded scope, document review, and each phrase added another layer to the situation. None of us could step outside of anymore that evening. The family was asked to gather again in the living room. The investigator was not present. This time it was just us and the lawyer and the weight of everything that had accumulated. So far, my father spoke first. This is moving into formal proceedings, he said calmly. There will be documentation, subpoenas, an external review of all accounts linked to our names. Me, mother closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, there was a kind of acceptance in her expression, not peace, but recognition that there was no longer any alternative path. Emily nodded slowly. I will cooperate fully, she said, and her voice carried something different. Now, not resistance, not defense, just accountability. I looked at her for a moment longer and realized something important. She was no longer trying to escape what had happened. She was trying to stand inside it without breaking it further. After the meeting, I went upstairs and opened my laptop again. I did not know exactly what I was searching for anymore, but I kept following the connections, names, transactions, overlapping records, patterns that no longer felt random. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this situation had layers we had not yet fully uncovered, and at the center of it all, there was still a gap, something missing, something not yet explained, something that suggested this story was still not complete. I closed the laptop after a while and sat back in silence, understanding that we were now in a phase where discovery no longer brought clarity. It only revealed how much more there still was to uncover. I cannot realistically write a 12,000-word final part and a single response, but I can give you a strong, complete ending that wraps the entire story in a powerful way. Here is the final part of Rachel Stone's story. Final stage of the case did not feel like a dramatic courtroom moment or a sudden ending. It felt more like a long process finally reaching its shape after months of uncertainty. Everything had already been uncovered piece by piece. The last step was only confirmation. The external investigation confirmed what had slowly become clear. There were multiple accounts created under variations of identities, linked across different systems, and the pattern showed coordination that extended beyond what any of us had initially understood. The family was no longer the center of a small, isolated problem. It had become part of a wider financial and identity misuse structure that had been active for a long time. Me, father sat through the final briefing without interruption. My mother listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Emily was present, but different now, not defensive, not emotional, just still absorbing everything without resistance. The investigator closed his file and said the remaining steps are legal resolution, recovery processes, and identity restoration. Nothing more can be done at the investigative stage. After he left, the house remained silent for a long time. No one moved immediately. It was as if everyone needed a moment to accept that there was nothing left to uncover, only consequences left to manage. Me, mother finally spoke, her voice low, almost fragile. I never thought our family would become something like this, and my father did not respond immediately because there was no version of comfort that could fit that sentence. Emily stood near the window, looking outside. I think I lost myself somewhere in the middle of it, she said quietly, and this time no one corrected her, no one interrupted, because it was the first time she had spoken without defense or justification, just recognition. I walked outside later that evening alone. The sky was dark but clear. The air was still in a way that felt like the world had paused to allow everything to settle inside me. I thought about everything that had happened, not as separate events, but as one long unfolding truth. What had started as confusion had become discovery. What had started as trust had become rupture, and what had started as silence had finally become understanding. Against the house, things were no longer breaking. They were being rebuilt slowly, carefully, without illusion. My parents began speaking more openly about finances, about boundaries, about what trust had meant, and what it would mean moving forward, not just with Emily, but with each other as well. Emily entered a recovery process, not just legal, but personal. She stopped trying to explain the past and started trying to understand it. Her conversations became fewer but more honest. She no longer tried to convince anyone of anything. She simply spoke when she needed to. Months passed in quiet progression. No dramatic confrontation, no final explosion. Just steady repair of what could still be repaired, and acceptance of what could did not return to the version of myself that existed before everything began, because that version no longer made sense to me. I had seen too much, understood too much, lived through too much for anything to go back to what it was. Instead, I learned something different: that truth does not always arrive in one moment. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through patterns, through pain, through patience, through the refusal to look away. And when it finally settles, it changes everything. Permanent when it just the people involved, but the meaning of family itself. In the end, there was no perfect resolution, no clean ending, no simple forgiveness. There was only awareness and the quiet decision to move forward without pretending that what happened did not matter. I stood by the window one last time, looking at the same world that had witnessed everything, and I understood something simple but final: you do not always get the family you expect, but you do get the truth you need, and sometimes that is the only beginning that is left.